At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. I have a guest today that I am really excited about. We have Dr. Breese Annable. She is a doctor of psychology, PsyD. She specializes in working with people with eating disorders, disordered eating, and negative body image. And she uses the dialectical behavioral therapy approach, which I'm a big fan of because there is such a big mindfulness component to that approach. And we're going to learn more about that today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our show today is about body image and body dysmorphia. And so I want to outline what body dysmorphic disorder or body dysmorphia is. It is excessive worry about the way a particular part of our body looks, which is often unnoticeable by other people. And body dysmorphic disorder, BDD, diagnosis has increased since COVID because video conferencing. So being on a Zoom, being on another type of video conferencing platform makes people more self-conscious about their appearance. So this has become more prevalent in the last few years. And also, according to another journal article that I read, published in 2015, a little bit earlier, the suicide rate of those with body dysmorphic disorder is 22 times greater than that of the general population. In another study, it showed that 89% of American women are dissatisfied with their bodies, and 84% of those women want to be thinner. So I'm going to say that again. This particular study that they did in 2015 showed that 89% of American women are dissatisfied with their bodies. I had to take pause when I read that. That is very high. This is becoming more of a global experience. Before, the studies were showing that it was more isolated to certain cultures, certain countries, but now it's just like this global issue. And I would imagine a lot of that has to do with social media. And they say that medication and therapy are some really good ways to treat body dysmorphia in mindfulness practice.
Yeah, well, first, I think one of the things I'll say is really to kind of discern body dysmorphic disorder and negative body image. A lot of times people use those terms interchangeably, and body dysmorphic disorder is really this experience where a person has really like a hyperfixation on a particular part of their body. And certainly it can be more than one body part, but a lot of times it is really like narrowly focused on a particular feature, but a lot of times it is a perceived flaw, but there is this obsessive perseverative quality. And so, for example, that could be on the shape of your nose. It really has a lot of similarities to like OCD. When you think about OCD, those like compulsive behaviors. So certainly it's not uncommon for people to seek out cosmetic surgery or, do things to significantly alter those features. Somebody can very easily end up feeling like they're on this hamster wheel of perseverating on it, trying to find fixes, but then really none of it actually solves the whole cycle. And so people can deal, of course, with a lot of avoidance of social situations, avoidance of life. So that body dysmorphic disorder has that kind of that characteristic of that intense hyperfixation on particular parts of the body. Whereas with negative body image, we're talking about our relationship to ourself, our perceptions, our thoughts, our feelings. And, certainly sometimes there can be a perception of what our body appears that might be different than what other people see. But it really is that relationship with our bodies.
Would you say that, and I know the DSM probably doesn't say this, but would you personally say that body dysmorphic disorder is maybe a subtype of OCD?
Yeah, I would definitely say it is more of in that family of OCD. See a lot of that same cycle. Again, it lines very much up with those compulsive behaviors. That the whole point of any of those compulsive behaviors is to feel better in the short term. Ultimately, though, in the long term, what the brain learns is, oh, we felt better in that moment. Even if simultaneously you might feel shame or fear or really painful things, there's a part of our brain that is saying, do that again. And again, certainly you've got that overlap between, for example, a lot of people with negative body image will do a lot of body checking, looking in the mirror, or even just reflective surfaces. But then we have, like, on the other end of the continuum is avoidance. So a lot of times people experience that swing between hyper focusing, and then other times kind of swinging more towards avoidance because it's just like, I'm too scared to know. I don't want to even look.
Yeah, and I can see how the mindfulness would be really helpful if some of those obsessive actions are helping you feel better in the moment. You can use your mindfulness to notice that pattern, notice that that's going on. And you did mention the brain. I did read a little bit about some research about body dysmorphic disorder and the brain. The science shows that people with body dysmorphia have atypical brain activity in areas of the brain that are responsible for processing visual stimuli. So, for example, one study showed that there's greater connectivity between the amygdala, temporal cortex, and the frontal gyrus. They say that this arrangement enhances visual detail perception, which they believe is why someone in this situation might notice small imperfections more. This was published in Psychoneuroendocrinology in 2019. Another study showed that when people with BDD drew an object, they detailed more specific parts of the object instead of the overall structure compared to controls, which I found particularly interesting because way back years and years ago, I was an art teacher. So the fixation that you were talking about on these certain parts.
Yeah, well, and I also think it's interesting to think about it from just kind of a whole nervous system perspective as well. You know, when our brain is in fight or flight, which, you know, that's the amygdala that they're talking about on a brain level, like that's our alarm bells in our brain for that fear response. And, you know, one of the things that the nervous system does, really, it's this whole system response. And one of the things that happens is that our focus becomes narrow. We have to focus in, right, on the threat that's in front of us right now, right? We don't want to use our energy, our attention on extraneous things. We're just hardwired. We're primed to then narrow our attention and our focus on the threat. In that experience of BDD, the body itself is experienced as a threat.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I love the way you explain that. Again, the mindfulness, right? To be mindful that, yes, I'm in fight or flight. And I don't know how you work, but I work with clients to be mindful that they're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and then to soothe themselves and know this isn't a good time to have a deep conversation. This isn't a good time to make a decision. This maybe isn't a good time to make judgments about my body. So I can see how the mindfulness would be so helpful. What's scary about whether it's negative body image or body dysmorphia is what it can lead to. It can lead to depression. When I talked about suicide, it can lead to disordered eating and eating disorders. Can you describe the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders?
It is a continuum of how impactful those particular problems are, how often it's consuming their thoughts. And then, of course, you know, the impact on physical health. Certainly the physical impact of eating disorders is well known. A lot of times in our culture, the physical consequences of disordered eating are culturally normed. It's kind of okay and accepted as a part of, for example, losing weight. That does not mean, though, that the physical consequences are any less significant as far as the impact on one's body.
Thank you so much, Breeze. That's really helping me understand this better. I have a question for you. One of the important pieces about this challenge, about the way we view our body, is that we often view our body falsely through someone else's perspective. We're imagining how someone sees us. And I wondered if there was a name for it, because I Googled, I was trying to see if there was a name for this, because I think when we have names for things, it's so much easier to talk about them. It's so much easier to name it when it's happening, like shame. I'm so glad there's a word for shame, so we can talk about it and we can name it when it's happening. I'm in a shame cycle is the way that I talk to my clients about it. So is there any kind of name for this phenomenon?
There are limitations to language in a lot of ways, and yet there's also such a value to be in the practice of mindfulness. I teach it as observe and describe. Putting a name and a label to something can really be so helpful in stepping back, getting that space and distance of going, oh, I see what that is. I can name it and label it rather than participate in it. I say to people all the time, you can really name it anything you want. What you name it, I think, is a lot of times less important than you name it. That being said, a lot of times people talk about that as projection. I am assuming, or I'm kind of taking on the idea of how I'm actually feeling and assuming that's how other people are seeing me. When we talk about the role with depression and suicide, and I think a common thread through all of that is isolation and disconnection.
Isolation is so real. And I think that's why working with a therapist, working with a coach is so helpful, because during those sessions, you can really learn and get better at being in those social situations in a way that feels more healthy, in a way that's more mindful, in a way that you're not feeling that pressure, right? Because you don't want to be in those situations. You want to isolate yourself because it's almost too much pressure because of these thoughts that are going on and these emotions that are coming up around the way you believe that you look. I think that connection with a therapist or coach is really important. Self-criticism is such a huge piece here, self-criticism of our bodies. And we become self-critical actually to be self-protective, even though in the long run it's not helpful. And, as far as shame is concerned, we create shame to avoid criticism. So I'll say that again. When we're children, we create this self-critical, this shame type thinking to avoid further criticism, to avoid abuse, for example. So it is a protective strategy. What do people need to know about this self-criticism and how it relates to being protective?
Shame is being, I think, talked about more. I don't know how much of that is just kind of the sphere bubble that I'm in, but definitely it's being talked about more. A lot of people may be familiar with Brene Brown, for example, who has been a huge figure and person in collectively, talking about shame more. I think so often, there's certain emotions that I think get a bad rap, and so often, we think about like shame is a bad thing, is a negative thing. And for sure, it's incredibly painful. And yet all of our emotions have continued in our evolution for a reason. Every single emotion we have has a purpose. And really the purpose of shame is to keep us connected with others. Right? Shame comes up when we perceive a threat, whether it's rejection, judgment, from other people. Shame comes up, and every emotion that we have makes us want to do something very specific. We're hardwired for it, and shame makes us want to hide. It could be hiding physically fully, as we have been talking about, like don't go to the party, don't go into the office, those different things. It could also be hiding a part of ourselves, hiding a quality that we have. That could even be inhibiting our laughter, or, if we've been told that we're quote unquote too much. It can also be hiding our bodies. Shame, again, is that emotion that comes up when we have a perception or a real experience of rejection and judgment from others. And again, shame comes up and says, we need to be connected. Hide that part of yourself, whether it's physical, whether it's a quality, to stay connected with others. And this is where mindfulness comes in, that it can be an opportunity for real curiosity for people, of pausing and saying, like, is there something that this way that I'm speaking to myself, is there something that could be protecting me from, or a way that this is helping me? Now, not ultimately effective, but in this moment, in this very like primal, like immediate sort of way, does it feel like this criticizing myself is doing something? For example, the self-criticism motivates me to do something, right? To change this about myself. If I can change this part of myself, then I'm not going to get caught off guard, or I'm going to be motivated to change this or to do this. And to move into mindfulness, where we can pause, which is no small thing when shame is activated and self-criticism is activated, but to pause and to get really curious. Is there something about this criticism that feels like it is helping me?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that being mindful of the shame, and it might be verbal, it might be actually words that you hear in your head. But if we can take pause, it's actually a gold mine for mindfulness. I like to refer to these as gold mines. Like it seems so negative, but if you just take a look and be curious, all that you can learn about yourself, and specifically asking questions about what is this negative self-talk protecting me from? I mean, that can be some really interesting awareness that you come up with. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about the shame being, quote, motivating. And the research shows, Kristen Neff has done some research that shows that self-compassion in place of this shame that's supposedly motivating is actually can be even more motivating. So I'll clarify that. Self-compassion is shown in the research to be more motivating than shame. So, because I know that comes up for a lot of people. Well, I have to be self-critical because if I don't, then I'm not going to be good at all these things. But I do want to clarify, just because I have clients who are listening, we talk a lot about shame. Shame, although it developed because of maybe some things that, quote, could be helpful, all in all, shame isn't the healthy approach to all of this, right? So that's why we learn mindfulness, and Brees and I are having this discussion, is to learn about what we can do instead.
Absolutely. I always think there are two speed bumps to every emotion. Is it valid and is it effective? There is value in the diversity of bodies of all shapes and sizes. When you talk about self-compassion, I think about this idea of antidotes to shame. And so we can have that on the individual level. I always think there's three flows of communication: other people to us to other people, and ourselves to ourselves. That self-compassion is looking at that flow of communication, that relationship ourselves to ourselves. All of these different antidotes to shame, and self-compassion is absolutely a big one. And I say to people, like, it works better and it feels better. Because again, when we talk about that threat system we were talking about earlier, when we are being self-critical, whether it's, again, even if it's we're saying to ourselves, those threat systems are activated. And what happens is that we close down, we shut down, we hyperfixate on those things. Whereas self-compassion has the potential to regulate our nervous system in a way that allows us to open up, to expand, to rest into a moment, which, certainly, as you were kind of briefly touching on a minute ago, it's not an easy thing to do. And there can be fears that come up with that. It impacts our threat system in a really positive way that changes this whole way we can perceive and think and feel and behave.
We are going to take a 30-second break. You have asked for it, and it is here, a free monthly TSD Mindfulness online meditation group. Join us every third Saturday at 10 a.m. New York time, which is 3 p.m. London time. You will receive instruction, participate in discussion, and experience a guided meditation. Register at T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And we're back. Negative self-talk and shame can trigger you into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, for sure. With almost all of my clients, we've had lengthy discussions about how mindfulness can be used to stop shame cycles, to limit negative self-talk. So here's how I do it. And then I'd love to hear what you do with your clients. We use that mindfulness to be aware of our devaluing thoughts. So that's one of the first steps, is to be aware of those thoughts that come up. And then the way I describe it, then that leads to the feelings of shame. And we actually have a tool where we write them all down. We write down all those devaluing thoughts that come up around these different situations, whether it's an action that we took or that we didn't take, or when we make a mistake, or when someone is silent in response to us. Like, there's all these different scenarios that trigger these shame cycles. So that's the first thing, just being really aware of what it sounds like, what it feels like also in your body, and what emotions are connected to your shame cycles are all ways to be mindful of this experience. And then the next thing that we do is we correct the devaluing thought. So it's actually just like speaking back to those thoughts and saying something like, well, actually, that's not true. Instead, I'm strong, I'm healthy, some type of correction. So that's the nuts and bolts of the way that I work with clients. I'd love to hear your strategies.
The quote that I share with people is from Viktor Frankl, and he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. That is the goal of mindfulness, is to create a space between what we're conditioned to experience, right? Or something that happens, and then how we are conditioned to respond, whether that's thoughts, emotions, body sensations. And what mindfulness helps us to do is to hit the pause button. That reaction is happening. And very often, like, there is nothing we can do about it. In the moment, it's like, here it is, here we are. But what we can do is hit a pause button between the stimulus, so to speak, and acting on our response. I also offer people an acronym that's from DBT as well, and it's the STOP skill. The S is stop, like stop your body, stop what you're doing, pause, like physically, literally pause in that moment, because you're saying, wait, something is happening right now. Something is really important is happening. The T is take a step back. Take 10 deep breaths. The breaths aren't necessarily to change anything or to do anything, but just, again, a wedge between what's happening and the reaction that the urge that I have right now. The O is observe. And I throw in like the describe too. This is where we were talking about the observing and the labeling practice. And then the P is proceed skillfully. A lot happens between the O and the P where we pause, right? That is our space. And, in therapy, that's where our work is. The higher our emotions are, our thoughts feel like truth. But when our emotions can settle down, then a lot of times we have that ability to go, oh, that's a thought. We can have more flexibility around it. But when our emotions are heightened, our brain goes, nope, this is true. To have a moment where we can be with the pain of the shame and of the self-criticism. It's not an easy thing to do at all. And it might even be 2 seconds that somebody could stay there. And then the opportunity for self-compassion, even if it's not with words, but a tone and a feeling.
I loved what you said about we really tend to believe our thoughts when our emotions are high. That's so true. And I think that this emotion of insecurity is felt. And then we have this thought of, I'm not good enough. And that gets all tangled in, and people experience that as the same thing, but they're actually two different things. Feeling insecure, having an insecurity is a human response, a natural human response, especially if we've had past trauma. Mm-hmm. But this thought, I'm not good enough, is something different. And so I like the idea of kind of disregarding the thinking, but moving to that feeling of insecurity and giving yourself compassion around it and the humanness of it. Kristen Neff I'm such a huge fan of her work, and she really brings in that connection to humanity. Like, I'm a human being on this planet, and we feel insecure sometimes. That's just how it is. And that's okay. And you can love and accept yourself with that feeling. There's a DBT skill called opposite action. And first you need to acknowledge that you have an emotion, and then be mindful of how you want to act or how you're going to act or how you're acting. What is your behavior in response to the emotion? And then do the opposite, which if any of my clients are listening, just know this is not something that we do. We have kind of a thing that's like very different from this, but I'm really interested in this. And I also want to add that it seems like this really only works if your response is unhealthy, because if you're having a healthy response, which is what I'm really working on my clients with, and I'm sure you are too, but educate me on this opposite action DBT skill. I'm really curious.
I think about our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors as gears that lock into one another, and we are hardwired for them to go together. Every emotion we have, we are hardwired to behave in a certain way. Thinking about those gears locking into one another, an emotion comes up, we're primed to think in a certain way and act in a certain way. We can look at shame, for example. If we are avoiding people who actually would accept us, that shame is not valid and it's not effective, because we would end up isolated. So when we talk about, for example, like the connection we were speaking about before with depression, right? It's not effective the more we isolate. Then opposite action can be a strategy. And I love it because I think ultimately it is this process of working with our emotions at times where it's like we can tell like, oh, this emotion, I need to follow its lead. As far as opposite action, if we have that time where we're like, okay, this is not valid, I don't have the facts, or it's not effective, then the place that we can start is to say, okay, well, if this behavior, for example, makes me want to isolate, then connection, being around people, is the opposite action. Certainly, we might want to be really thoughtful about who we connect with. Seeking out people that might be validating, might, give us an experience as an antidote to the shames. We might want to be really thoughtful about that. So it's changing our behavior. But the thing with opposite action is that you have to do it all the way. You have to throw yourself into the experience as much as you can. And so that might be a process of over and over bringing your attention to the present moment. I talk about participation as a mindfulness skill, where you throw yourself into the present moment of the experience. If we're in that fight or flight state, then sometimes it's helpful to do some skills to help regulate our bodies as well. So if we think about those gears, we can't just change one. We're using our behavior as leverage to try to start to change our emotions, but we have to really put in effort to get all those gears turning.
So someone has an emotion of insecurity that just comes up really quickly. They might not even be aware of it, be mindful of it, but it does instigate these thoughts of my thighs are too big, something like that. And then they think to themselves or decide, when I go to the party tonight, I'm going to make sure nobody takes any pictures of me. I'm not going to be in any pictures. So the opposite action would be, no, actually, I am going to be in pictures. I'm going to feel good about myself and really enjoy the night.
Yeah, it could be that. I mean, I think I always have such a respect for how painful those experiences are. And so maybe somebody says, pictures, that's maybe a bridge too far right now.
Okay.
But I will go to the party and I will be there and I won't let myself isolate. And so maybe that, even if it's on the one hand, I know saying throw yourself in all the way, that doesn't mean that you push yourself to things that are just too hard,
okay,
you're not ready for per se. So there can be a counterbalance there of saying, okay, if I can maybe go to the party for an hour and I will go and I will do everything I can to participate and throw myself into that experience as much as I can. Mm-hmm. If that feels like what I'm capable of, then that can be a win. So it doesn't mean that it's just like I'm able to do all the things and it's as simple as saying like, let me just dive in the deep end. Yeah. Of course not. It can be incremental. So it's that counterbalance of what do I feel capable of doing, even if it is a small step, and can I throw myself into that moment? And then sometimes we check into with ourselves and say, how do I feel now? And sometimes though we feel like, okay, I could stay for 15 minutes longer, or, so it can be take a small step.
Thank you for that clarification. You want to pick something that really does feel doable. Well, Brees, I'm so grateful that you are on the show today. This is such a valuable conversation for anyone who experiences negative self-talk, shame, which is really all of us. We can all benefit from some part of this conversation. So I would love to hear more about what you specifically do in your private practice, who you serve, and how people can get a hold of you, your website, things like that.
I primarily do individual therapy. And so I work with people, as we've been talking about, who are struggling with eating disorders or even just a relationship with food or their bodies that has been a struggle. I work with people with anxiety disorders and OCD as well. And as we've been talking about, I primarily use a DBT approach, which really blends these practices of mindfulness and self-compassion and acceptance with some of the more kind of traditional approaches to therapy that we have, and from kind of a Western perspective, whether it's like CBT or more behavioral approaches. So it really is this blend of those two things. So people can find me. My website is Living Balance AVL, like Asheville, livingbalanceavl.com. Although I see people across the country in more states than not.
Reese, I've been to your website and it's excellent. So please, listeners, I will link that in the show notes so you can go right to her website and you can see all the different states that she is licensed in. Well, thank you again, Reese. It was so wonderful having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD Mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.